How does Europe prepare for the possibility of 4 more years? Donald Trump formally launching his bid for re-election at a rally in Orlando, Florida, Tuesday evening.
That is why tonight I stand before you to officially launch my campaign for a second term as President of the United States. Thank you.
Trump's tenure so far, including skirmishes with Brussels, Berlin, Paris over trade, climate change, and defense, as well as an embrace of like-minded eurosceptics from Italy, Poland, Hungary, and the Brexit camp in the UK. So, is Trump a one-off, an outlier, or the embodiment of a broader blowback against globalization, against the so-called elites, against those who on this continent mismanage the financial crisis and the migrant crisis? Is it out of Trump's playbook when, for instance, EU leaders strike quiet deals with Libyan factions to keep refugees from crossing the Mediterranean? If the Atlantic Alliance as we know it is on the way out, what can the EU do when it comes to its own sovereignty, its own defense, the weaponization of the US dollar, how to stay in the Iran nuclear deal it signed and not be forced to follow the Trump administration's maximum pressure policy? What's the long-term plan for dealing with the United States? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at the official start of Donald Trump's campaign. With us, Nicholas Dungan, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council. How are you?
Very well, thanks. How are you?
We want to welcome from Brussels, Dominika Kozic, who is Brussels correspondent for Polish state broadcaster TVP. Welcome back to the show.
Hello.
Martin Michelot, Deputy Director of the European Institute for European Policy, is also with us from Brussels. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And sociologist Jen Schrady is with the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po. Your new book out, The Revolution That Wasn't, Digital Activism, How Digital Activism Favors Conservatives. Thank you for being with us.
My pleasure.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Now, Donald Trump, you'll recall, surprised the field in 2016 with a very direct us versus them style that goes over the head of allies, institutions, and the usual conduits for politics.
2016 was not merely another four-year election. This was a defining moment in American history. Ask them right there. By the way, that is a lot of fake news back there. That's a lot. That's a lot.
He's pointing to the press gallery there, Jen Schrady. He does pinpoint something true, that 2016 is a defining moment in that respect.
Absolutely. And what is fascinating is that it has been so much on Trump since 2016. But the reality is that this movement was building long before Trump became president. And that's what I think it's important to
Okay,
really
so you're cutting the chase here. He's not an outlier at all.
He's not an outlier at all. And in fact, when I was doing some research and spending time with conservative activists, patriot groups, Tea Party leaders, and they were saying very similar things. They felt like the news media wasn't accurately representing them, and that they really needed to have their own way of communicating information. And so they tended to use the internet a lot more. And Donald Trump really capitalized on that. Yes, we tend to pay attention to Trump's tweets every day. It's hard not to, as a scholar or a journalist around these issues. But the reality is that there's a whole broad grassroots ecosystem that is very supportive of Trump and has continued to be so.
And so no longer are there venues like this one, a program where people of different opinions speak to one another. You can have your echo chambers and whip up frenzy among the faithful.
In some ways, it's true, right? We have different echo chambers. And if you look at any analysis of who's tweeting what or posting what, people on the left tend to have a very different kind of network bubble than those on the other side. But what I found also is that those bubbles look very different. Not only are conservatives using the internet more, they're doing it in very different ways. Folks on the left tend to be talking about a wide variety of issues that are of interest to them. And groups on the right and Trump supporters are super hyper-focused on clear issues that work really, really well, particularly with social media and particularly with their base.
So as we look at it from here in Europe, basically this change we're witnessing in the United States is not going away, nor is this talking, as you describe it, at cross purposes between the left and the right.
Yes, I mean, as we see in, as you mentioned, election results among the far right throughout Europe is very strong. But I think that, we can't ignore what's happening here in France with the Yellow Vest movement that continues, that does kind of cross those left and right lines a little bit. And I think those are the types of issues that we really need to understand more deeply to know that populism isn't just a right-wing thing. It also is a left-wing as well.
Jen Schrady there effectively saying that Donald Trump could be a two-term president, of course, and that even if he's not, the movement that he embodies is here to stay.
Well, you said that this is the sort of forum where people can disagree with each other, but the problem is we're likely to agree. In fact, we do agree. But I come at it from a slightly different angle. I started saying back in the beginning of 2016, so January of 2016, that Trump represented a side of the American personality, the Jacksonian side of the American personality, right? Kill the Indians,
this is
despoil
in
nature.
the early 19th century.
The Far West, right? What the French call le Far West. That Trump, even though he's from New York, he was actually from Queens, that he represented that kind of Far West side of the American personality, which Europeans didn't identify with, and they certainly didn't actually identify as being very post-war American. And I think that so we end up seeing, and then you said that that population, used social media particularly well. But even when I first became president of the French-American Foundation back in 2004, 2005 in New York, and I moved back to the United States after living most of my life in London and Paris, my adult life, what I found was a country whose values had changed. And I think we underestimate the fact that and to a large extent, yes, we're looking at an international phenomenon, Bolsonaro, Duterte, and so forth. But I also think that we're looking at a phenomenon that has roots in the United States, has roots in the United Kingdom, and those roots are Reagan and Thatcher. And I think that Reagan brought us Trump, Thatcher brought us Brexit in a kind of contorted way, because essentially what they said is your personal interest can prevail. We don't have to worry about the general interest. And the sense of the general interest, it seems to me, is much lower now and is much more under threat in the U.S. and in the UK.
So there are political currents which are long-standing. The difference, and this is what Jen Schrady studies, is that we're now in the digital age.
And we're in the digital age. So we have the underlying trends, and you can speak to this much more technically than I can, but the underlying trends are that obviously the messages are more immediate. As you said, the messages are more brutal, or can be more brutal. And so you get a lot of stuff that's lost in the noise, and then you get a few things that come through the noise.
All right, Nicholas Duncan pointing out that here in Europe, many people didn't understand the phenomenon as it was coming of Donald Trump back in 2016. Some, though, have latched onto it awfully quickly, even before he was elected. On Monday, the White House rolled out the red carpet for Italy's deputy prime minister, far-right leader Matteo Salvini, welcomed by Vice President Mike Pence and the U.S. Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo. Salvini, who's got a friend or two in Washington, you might say.
I think we agree on 99% when it comes to our worldview and what's to come. Vice President Pence hopes to work with me and the Italian government for a long time. The desire is mutual.
Martin Michelot, what did you make of Matteo Salvini's visit to Washington?
Well, it's a long list of European leaders who see that the only way they can gain credibility at the European level is to be seen in the presence or in the vicinity of Donald Trump or Mike Pence, because these are leaders whose support base in the European constituency is actually quite low. So for them, a visit to Donald Trump is sort of a marker of prestige. At the end of the day, of course, Matteo Salvini and other European leaders, it's not just him, have gone to Trump to also get some inspiration, because you've been discussing this previously. The United States is in lots of ways a precursor of the political debates that exist and the cleavages, the political cleavages that exist here in Europe. And I wouldn't be surprised that Matteo Salvini will come back with a few ideas on how to import new culture wars or new cleavages that may separate societies or separate countries between one another. And this is something that I'm personally quite concerned about, because what you see today in Europe is that in order to get elected, in order to be successful in the polls, you have to mobilize your base. You're not going to fish for votes in the center, you really have to mobilize your base. And this is something that Donald Trump has been extremely good at.
Donald Trump's been good at it, but when you look back at last month's European elections, it was a mixed bag across the 28 nations of the European Union.
Of course it was a mixed bag, and it was a mixed bag for President Macron in France. I think we made a huge case of the potential populist wave, because we didn't know what to expect from it, and therefore, we had a good time in a way scaring ourselves. Of course, the result is not as good for the populist nationalist movements as we expected, but we also can't fool ourselves and think that the fact that we may have a majority in the next European Parliament between the conservatives, the socialists, the liberals, and the Greens will mean that all of the issues are behind us. I think this would be, we would really be burying our heads in the sand, and this is what would actually lay the foundations to have much bigger concerns in 2022 with Marine Le Pen or in the next European elections in 2024.
Dominika Kozic, this week it's Matteo Salvini. Last week it was the president of Poland, Andrzej Duda, who was at the White House. He was welcomed by Donald Trump himself. The U.S. administration, which pledged an extra 1,000 troops to Poland. What does a White House visit get a Polish leader in terms of popularity back home?
Hello once again. I think that for Poland it is quite a different situation than comparing with France or Italy, because we have Russia as a neighbor. So American military presence in Poland is particularly important for us. And of course, from this PR point of view, as you mentioned, it was very successful visit of Polish president to US, because he was very warm welcomed in White House, and feedback in Poland was very positive one. Polish people used to like American presence because during the communism it was US who used to help to Polish people. So there's still this symbolic situation for us that we used still to consider US as our friend, our ally. And President Trump decided to send additional 1,000 American soldiers to Poland, and just in case another 2,500 American soldiers who are now based in Germany, they can be ready to go to Poland. And the other point was energy security. Poland will buy American gas, LNG terminal, so it was very important. And from this political point of view, it was of course very useful for Polish president, for the government party, because it shows that we have a strong friend in the US. And you mentioned Matteo Salvini, but of course it is a difference between Poland and Italy. It is a difference between Mr. Kaczynski and Morawiecki and between Matteo Salvini. First difference, it is attitudes towards Russia. Matteo Salvini as Marine Le Pen, they are both quite friendly towards Russia. Poland is much more skeptical from the obvious reasons, and it is this difference. And second, that maybe for Matteo Salvini, as you mentioned, it was kind of a political game. He wanted to show how important are Italy, that they are not isolated. But from the Polish point of view, it was much more practical because we really need those additional American troops in Poland.
So that is a big divider among those who are sympathetic politically to Donald Trump on the European continent, to the attitude towards Russia. Trump's attitude, he doesn't miss a chance to needle Brussels, to needle Angela Merkel. Can that maybe help overcome that divide over Russia and unite some kind of populist front, if you will, that's pro-Trump in Europe?
Yes, we can find some people like this, but I would like to mention one more thing. So I remind myself because that's quite interesting when you compare those recent visits paid to US, because before the Polish president, it was also Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban and Czech Prime Minister Babiš and Slovakian Prime Minister Pellegrini who visited US. So it shows that US is looking for new friends in this new Europe, because it is, of course, V4, Group Visegrad 4, and, of course, Italy. So it is quite interesting for me, this combination. It looks like America is looking for a balance towards this French-German domination. As we know, America doesn't have good relation now with both France and Germany, so maybe it is a reason why it's getting more friendly towards these other European countries.
Martin Michelot, how do you explain that list of visits we've seen recently, which, as Domenico rightly points out, also includes Viktor Orban of Hungary?
Absolutely. I mean, in lots of ways, Donald Trump is very comfortable with dividing and conquering Europe. I mean, this has been his strategy ever since he took office. He wants to identify who his friends and who his enemies are, and he doesn't shy away recently from, tweet bashing the president of the European Central Bank, who is supposedly artificially devaluating the euro against the dollar. He was unabashedly critical towards the president of the Commission, Juncker, before Juncker visited the United States. I mean, he is very comfortable with identifying who his enemies are on the European scene and welcoming those whom he considers can be useful in serving his project of dividing Europe. And the fact that he so warmly welcomed the Prime Minister of Hungary, Viktor Orban, is no surprise. But then you also have European politicians themselves who are using Donald Trump as a way to varnish their anti-EU credentials. The Prime Minister of the Czech Republic, who was mentioned, Andrej Babiš, ran a whole campaign in the European elections, having imitated the trademark red baseball hat of Donald Trump with the catchphrase "Stronger Czech Republic." So obviously, there are mutual interests between certain European leaders and Donald Trump, which are not hidden in any sort of way. But now the question is, does this have an actual impact? If you look at the formation of a populist force in the European Parliament, they have been able to unite around 2-3 key issues. But at the end of the day, I don't think that Donald Trump is for them the key facilitator of working together.
It won't be down to Donald Trump. We have to take a very quick break, Martin. We'll be right back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. Donald Trump has officially launched his campaign for re-election in 2020, and we're looking at it from this side of the Atlantic with Nicholas Dungan, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council. From Brussels, Dominika Kozic, who is the Brussels correspondent for Polish broadcaster TVP. Also in Brussels with us is Martin Michelot, Deputy Director of the Central European Europium think tank, and sociologist Jen Schrady with the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po. Your new book just out, The Revolution That Wasn't how digital activism favors conservatives. This week here in the French capital, it's the Paris Air Show. And so you had on hand the defense ministers of Spain, Germany, and France for the unveiling of, this is just a model, for a next generation European fighter jet, the replacement for the Rafale and Germany's Eurofighter. And it's one of these moments, Nicholas Dungen, where you can read a lot into this kind of symbolic event in the context of a NATO where Europe and the US seem to be drifting apart?
Perhaps, but I don't think that I think we need to distinguish between two things. One, what Donald Trump does and says, and on the other hand, what essentially the American administration does and says that may escape Donald Trump's attention. And two, I think we need to distinguish between the politics of politics and the policy side. So essentially between what Donald Trump does and says, he is essentially given the same message, which is that the NATO allies need to raise their defense spending. And people have said, oh, he might pull out of NATO. There's no appetite in the United States to diminish the defense relationship with the NATO allies in Europe. So, yes, this is symbolic in the sense that Europe needs to do more to take responsibility for its own defense. My colleague Benjamin Haddad from the Atlantic Council in the recent Foreign Affairs writes that Europe needs to take more responsibility both in defense and security, but also monetarily. The Airbus is what you're seeing today with the Eurofighter. This is a business, right? And it's a business that is French, Spanish, German, and British. And
but it's billed as this national security interest.
It's true. But I mean that's the same thing with
continental, if you will,
right.
security.
That's the same thing. That's the same thing is true of the American defense manufacturers and the other French defense manufacturers. But my point is, just as I think we need to separate the sectors and say there's what everybody's talking about in the political realm, and then there's what's actually happening, for example, in the policy realm. I'll give you a different example outside the business sector. In 1 week in Brussels, we saw the European Council, that's the heads of state and government, debating Brexit, but they were also given a paper that was prepared by the European Commission, which is the permanent administration, on the strategic relationship with China. And this is only 4 or 5 pages of text, but it puts in brilliant context the strategic relationship from all the way from cooperation to long-term strategic
So does the EU speak with a different voice when it comes to
I think the EU
the trade war? And we're going to be talking about a lot next week when there's that G20 summit and Donald Trump and Xi Jinping meet.
I think that you see the EU, all of the examples that have been given up to now in this debate have been of national leaders, the national leaders going to see Trump and so forth. But the EU has tremendous actual power of its own, which it hasn't really been exercising, but which it looks to me, and I was in Brussels seeing some of these people last week, it looks to me like Brussels is much more ready to, and that's not that. And now we're not talking NATO, we're talking business, we're talking sanctions, and so forth. In the same way, you have the European Parliament. So we have the GDPR data protection laws that were enacted a year ago. And in that same week that I was talking about, the European Parliament enacted a law against hate speech and so forth. You've got these fake news laws. You've got France's tax on the GAFAs. So Europe is actually starting to flex its muscles as Europe, not as the individual countries, not as Orban, Salvini, and the rest, but as the European Union. And maybe that's why Trump wants to bash the European Union, because actually the European Union probably in many ways poses more of a threat. So he's trying to do what people tried to do on Brexit, which is divide and conquer. And the more the Europeans stick together, the more the Europeans are threatened that way, I think the more likely they are to stick together.
This battle over regulating this brave new world we have, of this new era of capitalism where it's your data that is the important hot commodity, Jen Schrady. We've had shows here where people have said to us, from America, saying to us, we're looking to Europe to lead the way. Is that how you see it? Is that how it's unfolding? After all, America owns the internet, right?
It's not America, it's the top Silicon Valley tech firms that happen to be in the United States, for sure. Yes, in many ways, with the GDPR and the EU regulations and the lawsuits against Google that keep happening, I think a lot of folks are looking to Europe. But as you said, these companies are based in the United States. But I think a key issue, if we look at this very dystopian view of technology that we have right now, whether it's around democracy, surveillance, privacy, et cetera, there's so much focus on trying to tweak or regulate these platforms. And on the one hand, yes, these vertically integrated, huge monopolies need to be regulated. I think there's no question about that. But I think the challenge is that all the underlying inequalities and all the underlying corporate power that you see with these tech companies isn't new. Surveillance has been happening for a long time.
For sure. Edward Snowden's revelations about the NSA happened on Barack Obama's watch.
Absolutely. And, in the United States, we had COINTELPRO where, civil rights activists were surveilled. So the idea that by, targeting someone like Mark Zuckerberg, who is often seen as a villain, is going to really transform these technology tools, I think is misguided, especially because newer and newer systems will just pop up around the world.
So you're saying it's a dystopia under Trump, but not more of a dystopia than it was before?
I think, right. So, in some ways, if we look at the utopian era of the internet, right? So World Wide Web launched 30 years ago. And at the first 10 years, people weren't paying much attention to it. Then we had the dot-com boom. We had all the attention over social media. And then all of the so-called Twitter and Facebook revolutions. And people were gaga over how digital technology could transform politics. And as you said, we're very euphoric over it. Now we're in a very, the pendulum has swung the other way. We're in a very dystopian era around digital technology. But the problem is that regardless of which era, both systems still have these underlying inequalities, this underlying surveillance that's going to continue regardless of the
So you're saying
tool.
social media won't necessarily help or hurt Donald Trump get reelected?
Well, with Trump in particular, I think that social media and the use of it really kind of displays some of these power differentials, right? So you have, what I found is that, political groups with more money, with more resources, and also with more organizational expertise were much more likely to engage online, and those ended up being more conservatives. And I think that, it's interesting because I did my research before Trump's election, and I think what I found will only be exacerbated in this current era.
Really? The Democrats will not have learned their lessons, will not have understood data mining, for instance?
I think that it's more than a question of data mining. I think what I found was it wasn't just understanding the algorithm, although that is important. It's also being able to have a large constituency of organizations and institutions that are really engaging with these platforms. You can't just post something, right? And I think Nicholas had mentioned this era that we've transitioned to with the more, especially conservative leaders, focused on the individual, right? And individual freedoms. And that has really risen with the rise of the internet. Right. Mm-hmm. But I think that it's a mistake to think that it's just a bunch of individuals, just a bunch of individual Trump voters or Democratic voters that are going to make a difference. Or if the Democrats just develop an app, that will all of a sudden change things, right? What matters is on the ground and what kind of offline institutions are developing.
Martin Michelot, in part one of our discussion, you mentioned that tweet on Tuesday by Donald Trump where he took aim at the president of the European Central Bank for his warning that inflation is too low in the Eurozone. and that the ECB may soon have to restart bond buying. He's tweeted, German DAX way up due to stimulus remarks from Mario Draghi. Very unfair to the United States! Exclamation point. Your thoughts when you see that tweet? If you're an economist, maybe you'll chuckle at it or disagree, but it's powerful.
Well, the first thing is I'm quite surprised that Donald Trump takes the time to actually look at the German stock market. I mean, this is just my first sort of off-the-bat reaction. No, the second thing is it shows that he has pinpointed Germany as the sort of, be-all, end-all of his anti-European campaign. For him, the trade surplus that Germany benefits from in relationship with the U.S. is an anomaly that needs to be corrected. So you see it with the German cars, with the German steel. He has something against Germany, and he's really playing it out, acting it out in those tweets. But at the end, what he wants to do is he wants to restore a competitive balance, and he is using the full might of the United States to correct this. And in a way, he has a right to do so. But it also means that Europe has a right to respond, to impose its own tariffs, its own trade tariffs, its own trade barriers. It's a right to create a investment mechanism to invest in Iran over U.S. sanctions. And Europe also has a right. You showed the image of it. Europe also has a right to have a sort of protectionist defense market, which is no longer necessarily only furnished by American producers. So we're in a much more bipolar relationship with Donald Trump, and he can tweet things, and Europe can react. And Nicholas Nugent rightly mentioned this. Europe is really growing its adult teeth in terms of hard geopolitics.
Fast enough? Are they doing it fast enough?
Yes. Honestly, by the speed at which the European Union generally decides, which oscillates sometimes between glacial and no decision, what the European Union has done in the last 2 years, or ever since a couple of years after the election of Trump, I think is quite positive. And the next commissioner, the next president of the European Council, the next high representative for European foreign policy knows that this will be one of the foremost priorities on the agenda of the European Union, is how to engage with the United States, how to engage with China, how to engage with Russia in order to ensure that the voice of 400 million Europeans is actually heard. And this can be via military means, this can be via the other tools of security and defense, this can be via economic means. I think that the Europeans are starting to flex their muscles, and of course that the fact that it will be a political priority can actually encourage some to do this even faster.
Dominika Kozic, when you see in your home country, Poland, how much the economy is intertwined with that of neighboring Germany on things like manufacturing, energy, your thoughts when you see Donald Trump squarely taking aim all the time at Angela Merkel in Germany?
It's quite a difficult situation for Poland because, of course, Germany is our biggest neighbor, and we used to have quite intensive economical relation. So now the split between Germany and US is not in favor for Poland. From the first point of view, it looks like Poland can benefit from this because Poland can use this situation, but it is very dangerous, and I see that, and as I know, Polish government is looking very carefully for this situation and is trying to keep balance, to not exaggerate this problem between US and Germany, and in contrary, Poland pretends to be kind of the balance, kind of the partner between bridge between Germany and US, because as you mentioned, that's true that the Polish economy is quite close to Germany because there are many big German companies which are in Poland, and of course Polish companies even in Germany. So that our economies are quite close. So we don't, for us, this conflict between Germany and US is not very good. So it is a reason why Polish government is really moderate in this situation and is trying to make this situation much more soft, much more peaceful.
Nicholas Dungan.
I also think that we need to recognize that the institutions of the European Union actually are better at dealing with the long term and dealing with stable situations that unfold. There's a high degree of professionalism at the Commission, for example. And we've seen that even the European Council under the President Donald Tusk has had to do a lot of crisis management. But every time there's been a Brexit meeting, every time there's been a crisis of other kinds, the heads of state and government have come up with solutions.
Yeah, you say that, but at the same time, the Commission is prone to the same influence of lobbying. We're seeing it, for instance, right now.
That's true.
The arguing that's going on over when to make Europe carbon neutral. There's a lot of to and fro over that.
Understood. But I think it's not as subject to the minute-by-minute tweets of Donald Trump in the way that it functions. And consequently, I think when we get a new council president and a new commission president and a new head of the ECB and a new head of the External Action Service, I think we're going to find that those are probably going to be quite professional people who are going to be taking decisions based on what is seen as a pan-European interest in the longer term and probably less subject to the day-to-day sort of infighting that Donald Trump engages in.
All right, there's one crisis that can't wait for that day. It's the one with Iran, when its Atomic Energy Organization spokesperson announced this past Monday a 10-day deadline for upping uranium enrichment. He stated clearly that the ultimatum was intended not for Washington, but for the European signatories of the 2015 nuclear deal, arguing that it's Europe, which is under the threat of U.S. sanctions, that's now abiding by Washington's new embargo. Note that this Wednesday, after the German foreign minister's visit to Tehran last week, Heiko Maas in Paris, he and his French counterpart appealed to both sides with a diplomatic offensive that includes a new forthcoming visit by the UK's new Middle East minister, Andrew Murison.
We believe that the announcement made by Iranian authorities about the possible collapse of the Vienna Agreement is worrying. We believe that this is not in Iran's interests. On the other hand, we also believe that the United States' withdrawal from the Vienna Agreement was not a good thing, and that the maximal pressure they want to apply is contributing to the tension.
Dominika Kozic, here you have it, this nuclear deal. It's signed on to by all the permanent members of the Security Council, plus Germany and the European Union. One signatory decides to walk away from it, the U.S., and because the world trades in dollars, well, it basically imposes its rules on everybody else. Your thoughts?
I think that we should be very careful because it is not in our common interest to have a war with Iran. And I hope that in US will not decide for this war because it could be very destructive not only for the Iran, but of course for the US and the European partners. So I hope that finally that we will find kind of agreement, kind of compromise. I know that the situation is very tough, that there are those reports, but from the other side, we should be very careful. And the war with Iran, it is the worst thing we could have now.
All right, Donald Trump applying that maximum pressure, as he calls it, while the Europeans look to find some kind of an alternative. Nothing's going to happen during these 10 days, is it, Nicholas Dungan?
I don't think so. And I wrote
the EU can't do anything, can it?
Right. And I wrote an article for the New York Times back in 2007 called "It Could Be the Anti-Iraq," basically saying that we didn't need to have the split between the Western countries, in other words, the transatlantic alliance that we saw at the time of the invasion of Iraq, and that they had to stay in solidarity on Iran. And to be quite honest, the Europeans have made it very clear since the beginning that the Iran nuclear deal is meant to be the Iran nuclear deal and not an overall deal with Iran. Trump, Bolton, others have taken a very destructive attitude, just trying to undo what Obama did. There would be ways to improve this without courting the kind of
But the question now is what the EU does. What can they do with their diplomatic offensive? There's not much they can do because the world trades in U.S. dollars.
It's as you were saying, Jen. Trump is exercising the power that he has as president of the United States, and he does it willy-nilly. He doesn't. These alliances don't mean as much to him as getting his own way does, as winning rather than compromising and achieving consensus. The tagline now of the Atlantic Council is "better with allies" or "stronger with allies." Right? He doesn't get that.
All right, Donald Trump applying maximum pressure, as he calls it, but also at his rally on Tuesday night in Florida, promising voters no more foreign campaigns.
We're charting a path to stability and peace in the Middle East because great nations do not want to fight endless wars. They've been going on forever. Starting to remove a lot of troops.
Trady started this program by making the admission that, well, we all do, which is that sometimes we do pay attention to those tweets, and one tweet does change the news cycle or change the day's proceedings when it's the president of the United States. Here we're hearing two messages from the Trump administration. So it's the sort of instability of it all that's, I suppose, the novelty.
The instability and questioning Trump's veracity. Right, we've heard that many times. I think what concerns a lot of Americans, and I imagine people around the world, is that because this very slow impeachment pressure has been on Trump, with an emphasis on very, very slow, but it has continued, and it has continued to grow, that Trump might use the war with Iran to really distract from impeachment proceedings. And many have even said they've been surprised that Trump hasn't gone to war already to create such a distraction.
So what do you make of what we just heard him say at the rally in Orlando?
That works to win a campaign. I mean, he has...
But you're saying it doesn't prevent him from then...
I don't think it prevents him from potentially starting a war with Iran or anyone
take
else.
Troops out.
Martin Michelot, you agree?
Well, honestly, I think that if Hillary Clinton were standing on that podium announcing that she were running for re-election in 2020, I suspect, I have a hunch that she would have said more or less the same thing, because we know how long the United States has been engaged in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and obviously, these drawn-out conflicts are costing a lot financially, but also are taking a huge toll on the U.S. population. So I don't think that this is something that is completely surprising. On the other hand, it's a very traditional rally around the flag effect to want to create new enmities, and here in this circumstance, it's Iran, to basically distract from more domestic issues. And we know that Trump is very good at finding, one or two groups. The so-called Mexicans, for example, or the Central Americans who are causing issues for American competitiveness, the Germans, the Iranians. For him, he has moved on to this, and Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, they're issues of the past, and he is very much campaigning. That is for sure.
Martin Michelot, I want to thank you for joining us from Brussels. I want to thank as well Dominika Kozic for being with us, as well as Nicholas Duncan, Jen Schrady. More coverage of the build-up to that 2020 campaign in the United States on our website, france24.com.